It has always been odd to me that as America has grown in affluence, its people have grown more ignorant of the heritage that built our civilization. And by our people and ignorant, I'm talking about myself and many like me. And in exploring this question of how this could happen, I've run into a lot of books, and one I wanted to talk about a little bit today is one written in 1998 by Victor Davis Hanson called Who Killed Homer? The Demise of Classical Education and the Recovery of Greek Wisdom. Now, when I refer to the ignorance that most of us have, I don't even mean specifically kind of the dates of the Declaration or the founding of America, but I mean the deepest values that led to and organized that American foundation. Values that stretch back all the way to the Greco-Roman past. It really doesn't make sense. Previously, the people who were educated in, say, Greek and Latin, who knew Homer, Virgil, Livy, Plutarch, and more, they were wealthier. The elite educated class, even if they did not get PhDs, tended to be from wealthier families. The farming or working class also got some basics and classics training, though they often had much less schooling, so they had much less time with the classics. But America, all the way back to pre-revolutionary era, the colonizing era, always put a heavy emphasis on education and particularly literacy. Often it was a very religious reason for them. Nevertheless, the idea was that every individual citizen should be able to read the Bible, the Psalms, the catechisms, those works. For instance, early colonizers in 1638 brought the first printing press in America before they had barely settled the place. And to them, every person should have the ability to read the Bible, the Psalms for themselves. That was very important for them. And it remains an important value we have to this day. I think about this as, why was my generation, the millennials, a generation that was born into luxury, peace, and wealth, not at all generally educated in Homer and his legacy? At a time when we had affluence, even if you were among the poorer class, you had an ability of spending $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 per student per year throughout America, and yet nobody has been able to access the classics. Now, just as an example from my own life, I come from pretty low means, not impoverished by any means, but probably what would be considered in the area I lived in, Silicon Valley, lower middle class in Northern California. I'm an only child born to working class parents, neither of which went to university. Yet we had a decent home for the three of us. My parents worked, and we were able to afford things like TVs and a computer when they became affordable for the public. We could even go on the occasional vacation. Usually we had to drive, but still we could go. Like most parents, they wanted me to be educated, and they trusted the local school system. Even in this more affluent area, the Silicon Valley of the 1990s, there was no Homer, no Herodotus, no Thucydides, no anything. Even when my family lost most of our savings in the dot-com bubble, we moved to Texas, another middle-class area that we moved to. Same thing. No Homer, no Thucydides, no Aeschylus, no Sophocles, nothing. Whether American individuals should agree or disagree with any particular value of the West and the Greeks is irrelevant. That is not the point I'm trying to make. In fact, in the West, uniquely, we have a long tradition of debate, questioning, challenging, and the very dissent which has allowed the almost utter destruction of the Greeks itself. This value, call it open dissent of religious, political, and other authority, is absolutely 100% unique to the West and the building of it. Period. If you see dissent like this in other cultures, if you see people dissenting against their religious overseers, the way they do it is a Western value that goes all the way back to Homer. There is no long tradition of dissenting against the Ayatollahs in the Middle East or against military dictators in Latin America, as there is going all the way back to the descent of Achilles to Agamemnon and his fellow Greeks in the Iliad. Now, one of the best lessons I ever learned in this regard was actually in college at the University of Colorado. I took a Greek history course, and this was our textbook, actually, this one right here. And the first lesson that my teacher, my professor, taught us was he had us read an introduction from a similar course back in the 1950s, an introduction from a textbook at that era. And then the next class, he had us read chapter 1 of this, the more modern version. And he asked us, what was the difference? They're both about Greek history. They're both about the same subjects. What do you notice is the difference between them? And I was a little bit older when I went to college. I put myself through college, so I had dropped out when I was about 18. I went back when I was 23 after I had ran a little business and had enough money to go. And so I was a little older, so I waited around. I knew the answer. I felt like I knew the answer. I looked around. None of these 18, 19-year-old kids had any clue what he was talking about. And so I finally had enough. He was very patient. He was waiting for someone to answer. So I finally raised my hand and I said, well, one major difference is tone. So in the 1950s version, the classicist writing that textbook clearly revered the Greeks and the values that they espoused. This version that we have here, they do not revere. They have what I would think of as almost a mild disdain. It's like something you're supposed to do because you're supposed to, but there's obvious massive problems with the misogyny and they were racist and all these negative things. So that was the big difference, is a mild disdain versus a reverence. And I always take that as such a great lesson because it does show that there was a huge tonal shift in the way that the West and the very people who should be upholding these values, the classicists, the Greek scholars themselves, disdained their own craft and what they were actually studying. That to me is one of the most bizarre things. I can only imagine maybe a military man who does not like to kill and murder and conquer other cities, but sees it as a necessity because you have to do it to protect your own civilization or something, and disdains his own craft. Even then, you have to have some appreciation for it. It is utterly bizarre to have a whole people of focusing on the study and explication of this craft, and they are the ones who disdain it, who look down upon it. Now, one of the answers that Victor Davis Hanson and John Heath, I should say, mention in their book, Homer is Dead, chapter 1 being simply, Homer is dead, and they prove this through numbers, through explanations, and they even give some hints as to how he died. For instance, they talk about conferences that they would attend in the 90s. This book is 1998. So we're, almost 30 years from this moment. And what they mention are things like there would be sizable conferences with the few classicists that did exist, and they would be specializing and doing talks and papers on things like ancient Greek transvestism. And the question is, well, there's a shrinking number of people even studying the classics. And here is a chart that kind of shows recent times. This is, I think, 2020 or 2022, of the BAs, the Bachelor of Arts that were given in America, and their breakdown of the types of majors that people chose. And you can see classics are 0.5. In 1998, same thing. It was about 0.5, 0.7% of all the BAs awarded. Now there's more BAs awarded. So you'd think that the classics might rise a little bit. No, it's still the same percentage of the pie, but there's way more people with Bachelors of Arts that are not classics studied at all. So there has been a clear decline of these majors. And the people who do study it, they go to conferences, they put out papers, they put out dissertations that are really esoteric, really nonsensical. And there is no effort, according to Hanson and Heath, with lots of evidence if you want to read the book, there's no effort or thought on how to actually educate the public. There's no idea that maybe my job as a classicist is to actually go out and teach people the classics. They think of their study as the exploration of sexuality in ancient playwrights of Aeschylus and Sophocles or something like that. And how Sappho was really the greatest of all the poets of that time, which we have very little of her. So, or that Homer was actually a woman, which is complete nonsense. But that kind of thing is what they spent all their time on, rather than the question of how can we teach the millions of people who are gaining in literacy, who have access to a little bit more leisure time. How can we help them do this? There were a couple of translations of Homer that came out, but even there was a real failure, and there has continued to be a real failure to accomplish this goal. Now, what Hanson and Heath allude to and talk a little bit about, this is early, this is 1998, not 2026. They talk about a little bit of what replaced the kind of tragic Greek wisdom that used to form the core of a classics curriculum. And I think they rightly diagnosed that a lot of it is what we might think of today as the kind of whim-worshipping moral certainty that people have. Many people have this absolute moral certainty in the values they have inherited of, for instance, anti-slavery, which is the most easy thing to be against. And then they go back in history and they impose that value and judge everything according to that very narrow moral certainty, which is a good conclusion to come to, but it's not the way to judge someone thousands of years ago. It's completely inappropriate because they and their values of dissent and questioning and thinking and democracy, philosophy, and even consent of the governed by the people, which is a Greek concept, all these values, that's what led to the whole ability to be anti-slavery today. So if you cut off all the root, you don't even understand the basis of it, which if you ever have a conversation with somebody who makes this kind of loud claim about the evil of the old world without any understanding of it, you'll notice that they fall apart quite quickly. And one of the claims that Hanson and Heath talk about is what kind of replaced this, not just in moral certainty, but also if you look at even 2026, what replaced it are things like psychology, sociology, political theory, identity-based humanities. You have this rise of this whole new approach, this new paradigm that cuts off all the Greek wisdom, all the Greek thought, all the way that we used to unify. And even again, within disagreement, which is a Greek concept, that kind of Greek debate is a Greek concept, that was all cut off. So you'll notice that today we have a rise of debate is not cool. You cannot debate people. Back in the Greek times and even the Roman times, the only real intolerant is being intolerant of debate and dissension. You should be able to make an argument and think through these things. That is no longer the case. With the rise of psychology, we get meaning as trauma and healing. That's how today, the only way we can conceive of where meaning comes from for most of us. The fact that we have 42% of all Bachelor of Arts coming from psychologists, which is a new form of science, very untested, very unproven. It's not at a level that is able to actually provide great answers. And I think there's many, many problems with it, despite the fact that the field provides real value. Nevertheless, you'll notice that all meaning seems to come from your trauma. You can see this in Hollywood movies and in television shows. There's a rise of there's trauma that happened in this person's past. That's what explains this human. That's how they get meaning. That's not to say there's no truth to that at all, but that's the only truth there is. Or, the rise of sociology. What kind of answers does that give in replacing the Homeric value system? Meaning as structure and power, that all meaning comes from structures, from power structures, and that is where we get racism and sexism, and that we're in a patriarchy and all these kinds of things. Some of the observations they make are true, by the way, but the fact that that's the only approach people can have is because we're not looking back to the Greeks for the kind of debate system that they had. Political theory, meaning as justice and reform without ever addressing what justice is. No justice, no peace. And then you ask them, well, what do you mean by justice? And they're like, well, just do what we want you to do. That's what it amounts to. It's like, well, that's not justice. Again, the Greeks had whole systems of debate and discussion and challenges. And they, wanted to kill Socrates because of his challenging of the norms and the justice views that people had at the time. The legacy of that was, don't do that. We need to elevate values of debate and dissent. And then there's things like identity-based humanities, which has grown very popular. We all are very aware of the identity-based humanities, which puts meaning as things like your voice being recognized. That's what's important for finding meaning, rather than finding some kind of truth. Now, chapter 2 is called Thinking Like a Greek. And I really like this chapter. I like this whole book, but this chapter is really interesting because he goes into the Greek legacy and all the different values that we hold to this day, whether we know them or not. So these are values that are still somewhat embedded within us. Let me go over a couple of these unique Western values. And that is what I'm trying to emphasize, is this is why you should study the Greeks a little bit. You should encounter them. You don't have to become an expert. You should encounter them because it is unique to the world. It is what the Greeks added to the world. And just as a side note, if you go to troubadour.studio/Iliad or /Homer seminar, you can get access to some of my resources, or you can even take weekly discussion live with me, and we can, going through some of these great works. But here are a couple of values that the Greeks left to us. Science and acquisition of knowledge should remain separated from religion and political authority. So the whole idea of that there is a potential for acquisition of secular knowledge outside of religious and political authority, that is a Greek idea. You don't get that in other cultures, especially not to the tradition and to the extent. And that has led to the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution. It has led to the birth of all these great sciences that have led to our own, modern flourishing. Another value is military power should be operated under civilian control. And, even the way that our president as a civilian operates as the leader of the military, that is part of the legacy of that. Consensual government itself, that's a crazy idea in the history of the world, to have a consensual government, that the individuals matter in the society and not just some hierarchy elites. Not to say that there were not elites in Western world, there definitely were, but they often had to, and they all mostly had to make sure that they worked with the consent of the governed. And this is a thing that started in the ancient world of the West. So religion as separate and subordinate to political authority is pretty Western. Trusting to the individual over the mob is a Western concept. Now, let me be clear. All of these concepts or all of these values are not things that the West got right in the beginning or that we even get right today. The point is that they were values, and there's a tradition of this in our literature, history, teachings, and all the political structures that we've tried to build over the last several thousand years, trying to always be better at reaching these absolute objective values that are better. Individual ownership of property. That's a big one. And yes, that does go all the way back to the ancient Greeks in some form. As I've said many times, dissent and open criticism of government, religion, and the military, that kind of thing has been something that is a long tradition of fighting for that and accomplishing that in little bits and pieces throughout the West for thousands of years. Another one, very important, is that it's not race that separates man from man, but culture. So culture is important, not your genetic makeup. That is actually a Western idea. There's an ancient Athenian antiphon who says, quote, "By nature, we are all made to be alike in all respects, both barbarians and Greeks." Thus, to Hanson and Heath, quote, "It was logical, not an accident of this country's development, that the American Constitution, individual liberty, and free enterprise were not reserved for Europeans alone, but could but could evolve as the common heritage of anybody who chose to reinvent himself as Western, as a Greek, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were for grabs. And this actually historically is very prominent as the West went into a dark age. The dark age really refers to a loss of this Greek value system. But this loss of the Greek value system was actually taken up by the Muslims, the Islamic world. And they gave rise to all kinds of new sciences, new kinds of maths, astronomy, and all kinds of new things that we still learn from today. That was actually, they brought value into the human world because they had this paradigm of the Greek world. And then they started losing that, and that started going back to the West. And this is where the Renaissance happens. The Renaissance is a rebirth of this Greek paradigm system. So chapter 3 is who killed Homer and why. And I'm going to read a couple quotes here rather than go into all the detail. I think this book is worth reading. I will say, as one recommendation, if you are going to read this book, if you're interested in this question, I hope you will check out first my resources on reading Iliad, the Odyssey. I think you at least need to have read in translation, not a retelling or a reimagining. You need to have read those two things as a starting point. And then you don't have to master them, just have read them. This chapter is really about a study of the slow erosion of any form of education and academic humanities. It's just a sad erosion of this, maybe even an explosion against it, probably in the post-World War II era. So here's a quote. Professional educators and social scientists leaped into the vacuum, spreading therapeutics through the university, metastasizing their "I'm growing" and "tell us about yourself" like cancer cells in a weakened system. The seeds of the feel-good curriculum were planted, the crop of which we are harvesting in today's pressing concern for institutionally imposed self-esteem. Remember, this was from the 1990s. Self-esteem was a huge thing. We don't talk about that as much anymore, but it's still very relevant. What replaced self-esteem is probably this over-psychologizing trauma healing through this pseudo-psychological approach to things. Again, I don't like beating up on psychology too much. There are values to it, but I think it's a really young science and we put way too much value on it without really understanding the mind. We are still very ignorant about the brain and the mind, despite what a few neuroscientists and psychologists might tell you. I'm going to continue with this quote. Quote, "This new ultra-sensitive curriculum and its appendages, diversity training, journal writing, gender and racial sensitivity, multiculturalism, situational ethics, personal growth and self-indulgence, and the politics of commitments, ran directly counter to Greek wisdom." Now, those list of things might sound familiar to you because they're still prominent in 2026 and they're still part of the problem. Now, I think journaling is fine, but their point is very important. Their point is that journaling is not thinking. It's the expression the expression of your emotions in any given moment. Real thinking comes when you edit and you try to explicate a thesis based on argumentation and logic. That is, guess what? Greek. Here's another quote. "There is nothing particularly objectionable to universal inclusivity as a general warm and fuzzy principle, provided that faculty and students understand the real differences between these cultures. Like the Greeks themselves, classicists must never pretend that all cultures are equal. They know better than to speak the untruth that there is a Phaedo in Egypt, an Oresteia in Persia, or an Iliad in Assyria, much less democracy among the contemporary Germans, ancient Germans, or university in 4th century BC Gaul. Literature and philosophy, apart from religion, is exceedingly rare beyond the Aegean." And if you read things like Sun Tzu, you actually get this. Like, Sun Tzu is respected as this great military document. There's a lot of great things you can learn from Sun Tzu, but when you actually read any of it, you'll learn that it's actually much more aligned with becoming a kind of appropriate citizen or individual within this collective and how these types of things are the dominant paradigm of how you should be living, thinking, and even conducting wars. The questions are not how to defeat your enemy as such, but how to do so in a certain kind of religious, political way. What the West has done really well is address this question of what you might think of as wrestling with the inner beast. And this is why I think a lot of people misinterpret literature, is because they only think about the end result. So if you read the Iliad, people will think of Achilles as some kind of immature child who doesn't understand the world. And because they're not looking at literature as this kind of wrestling with this deep inner conflict, which is one of the great reasons to read the Iliad. It is the first time in literature we have an inner conflict represented in physical reality outside of itself. Even in Odyssey, you do not get that. The Odyssey is much more an external conflict. Most of the conflicts, I should say, are externalized in monsters or suitors or things of that nature. With the Iliad is about the wrath, the inner emotional value system at conflict within Achilles, whereas the Odyssey is much more the external things that get in the way of Odysseus getting home, including some of his own foibles, of course. What makes the Greek approach to things so beautiful, unique, and necessary is that, quote, the Greeks present a picture of their culture and say, this is the way it is. This is what we value. This is what makes us who we are. This is who is included, who excluded. And then blast the entire conglomeration to pieces. What is most often misunderstood about classical literature is that almost all of it was composed as a critique of Greek society and the very values that allowed it to flourish. The most important legacy of the Greeks and Romans is this uniquely Western urge to pick apart everything, every institution, tradition, and individual. Only in this manner do ideas change or improve at all. And only in this way does an author find any credibility with the reading or listening audience. Now, this leads to my favorite quote. Again, chapter 3 is one that I really like. And this favorite quote of mine, I constantly think about because I just have not found counter evidence to this. If you think there's counter evidence, I'd love to hear it. Now, remember, this is written in 1998, but I think it's still very true in 2026. So here's the quote. It is no surprise that in the last half century, there have been hundreds of symposia, conferences, and public discussions of Hiroshima in America. So Americans have questioned this. Almost all of these critique, all of it is critical of US policy. And at the same time, there are, quote, few Japanese-sponsored counterparts devoted to a careful anatomy of Pearl Harbor or such atrocities in Asia as the rape of Nanking. No public or private review of the Gulf War was published in Iraq after the death of tens of thousands. We omit the post-mortem rallies and victory parades. So we're not talking about that. Yet hundreds of books and articles criticizing our conduct of the war reached the American public when we lost but a few dozen soldiers. Anyone who knew of the Greek tradition would understand why that is so. To deny this tradition, to expose the beast without examining the Greeks' incessant battle with this creature, is to dismiss the real value of studying our past. I think this is one of the critical things for why you should study the Greeks, is to get outside of the value system that you've been born with in this new paradigm, the over-psychologizing, gender studies, diversity training, all these kinds of things, which has a kind of, let's not even think about the moral history of the past and different ways of approaching morality. But let's just say that what I tell you is immoral is immoral. That if you think that a man is not a woman, or it's not potentially a woman, if that's a kind of truth that you have, well, you're not a moral person. And we're not going to even question or think about this in any way. The not thinking about this in any way, which is so prevalent in this whole new paradigm I've been talking about, that is a cutting off of the Greek. Now, you can't take my word for it. The only way you could do it is by reading the Iliad, the Odyssey, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Plato, the Greeks and Romans, at least on some level, in translation. And you can go to troubadour.studio/Homer Seminar or Iliad And I'm often doing lots of resources to help you do that. Chapter 4 is called Teaching Greeks is Not Easy. I actually disagree with him on this one. He makes some really good points, but Hanson and Heath are classicists, and their approach really is the teaching of Greek and Latin and a lot of the classical Greek education system. I think there is a lot of value in that. My approach is much simpler because I want everyone to have some encounter with the Greek values. And this can be done quite easily with a little bit of work with translations and some guidance. And I want to mention just briefly a big difference and a big caution for people out there is between retellings and reimaginings versus translations. So you might have heard of like Madeline Miller and these other people who have reinvented, which is a common thing, and I'm not against it, reinvented Greco-Roman values. And what they do is they tell the story, but they tell it with modern value systems. They may not even be aware of this. I think they are. But when you retell some of these stories and you make the, Penelope or Circe or Achilles a homosexual, that's not Greek. Achilles was not a homosexual. There's nothing against homosexuals, but he was not a homosexual. So all that is just making a certain kind of modern value system and imposing that on a Greek system. That's completely normal. This starts very heavily with an English author by the name of Walter Scott when he writes a book called Ivanhoe, which is bringing modern English values of his time, putting them into a kind of romanticized vision of medieval knights and things of that nature. But nevertheless, it is that imposing of our values today onto the past, not the learning of the values of the past and how they apply to our present day. That is what a translation can do. And the last chapter is what we could do. And I agree with Hanson and Heath here, where they say, quote, all attempts to reinstate Greek wisdom by reforming higher education are ultimately doomed to failure in the absence of a larger American Renaissance. The irony here is that we have increasingly turned in despair to our university to do precisely what it cannot, to correct the fundamental malignancies of our modern culture. But no education, especially a college education, can undo 18 years of earlier grade school and parental failure. However, a few students can have their lives dramatically changed by a book, a class, or a professor at any age. And certainly there's no more rewarding experience for a teacher than to be part of such a metamorphosis. I think anybody can have this metamorphosis. And the lesson is that we have to take this on our own. Those of us who did not become raised with this, we need to have an encounter with the Greeks so we can begin to understand them, so we can begin the process of a new Renaissance, an American Renaissance of these great classics. And that starts with you reading a translation on your own or with me, something that you can approach. Try it, add it to your reading list, or if you don't read much, take it as a challenge. Going all the way back to chapter 1 of this book, Who Killed Homer, Hanson and Heath have this to say about why Homer has persisted through thousands of years, including Dark Ages. Quote, but the real reason the Greeks were still alive was because ardent students of Homer, some of them professional classicists, would not let him die. In the classroom and on the hilltops of the Mediterranean, at the Sorbonne, and in the study late at night, after a day at the firm, there were men and women who thought and acted like Greeks. A few odd voices did make a difference. Voices of those who saw larger questions beyond the details, who thought not of making a living from Homer, but of making Homer come to life for themselves. I am more optimistic than Hanson and Heath because of you, because of YouTube, because of the internet. It is now more possible than ever to encounter the Greeks, no matter who you are, what your educational background is, how old you are or young you are. I agree that our whole approach to education in America needs a rehaul, but I don't agree with Hanson and Heath's doom and gloom, which this is pretty gloomy. He actually wrote a book recently, The End of Everything. I don't think we're there. We do live in a spectacular time if you choose to embrace it. You have access to all of these great works at your fingertips. You can have access to the greatest courses, seminars all over the world at the push of a button for minimal price or even free. And there are people like me and many like me who can help guide you through the reading. And that's my hope, that just as there was a physical fitness revolution in America, as America got more and more office butt, starting probably after World War II again, what happened was there was a revolution of health. More gyms started opening up. There was more health fads. There's a lot of bad health fads, but the idea of being enamored by a health fad, I think, is a very healthy thing in a certain way, because it means that we want to be healthier. They represent a strong desire to be healthy and fit. The future should be physical and intellectual health fads. Run toward a fad that has you reading some challenging book. Try that course on physics. Study up on your Greek and Latin. Learn to build robots for fun and training. Never before has this been more applicable to us as human beings and achievable by all of us, any of us. Homer is not actually dead. He sits where he always sits. He's waiting for you, reigning supreme over all the world, patient and waiting to see who will come and read and learn and challenge him as he always expects you to. Thank you.